Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you how you can generate pieces of your UI at runtime based on your data for your game. So for instance, in this example, we'll create something like an item, which will be used to generate buttons based on those items. So this would be useful for something like an inventory system. So I'm going to create a little folder for UI at runtime in my project, and I'll just use this to create the visual tree asset files and any scripts for this tutorial. So let's jump into this folder, and I'll right click in the folder. We'll create a new UI Toolkit UI document. And I'll call this something like simple inventory list. Let's double click into here, and that's going to open up the UI builder window if it's not already, with this visual tree asset loaded in here. So what we're going to do here is just create an element which will be the parent for any item slots we want to add into it. So in the hierarchy here, I'm just going to add in a visual element. So this visual element, I'll just go to the top here and I'm going to call it item row. So when the game is running, we're going to have buttons that represent the items they're tied to loaded into this row going from left to right. So let's go to the flex style down here, and I'm going to make the direction row going left to right just to test roughly what that might look like. Let's go down to controls, and I'm going to add in a button here. I'm going to parent it to the item row, and let's just duplicate it a few times. Control D, Control D, Control D. So at runtime, we're going to load in a bunch of buttons to this item row, and they'll be created based on how many items we have. And so what will happen is when the buttons are clicked, there'll be a callback to a class which holds a reference to the item data and the button, and it will be able to respond by interacting with the item data in some way. For right now though, I am going to delete these buttons. I'm just going to save this file. And then let's create another UI document in this folder. So I'm going to right click, let's go to create. Let's do UI Toolkit, UI document, and I'll just call this item button. So let's double click to open this. The only thing in this hierarchy is going to be a button, so I'll just bring that in there. Now for the button, let's remove the text, and I'm also going to take the size, and I'm going to make it a hard value of 100 width and 100 height. So let's just type that in there, 100 for width and height. Just in case to make sure it's always 100 for width and height, I'm going to set the max and min for height and width to 100 as well. So pretty much guaranteed when we load it in, it's going to be 100 pixels, possibly scaled up based on our panel settings. So basically when we load it in, its base size is going to be 100 pixels. Now that can be scaled up based on the panel settings in your project. So your main UI document is going to have one of these panel settings if it doesn't already, and you can have it in scale mode, scale with screen size as I already have, or if you do constant pixel size, I believe that would mean that it would always be 100 no matter what the resolution is. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and we'll see that from my last tutorial, I already have the main UI, which has this title here, and then I'm loading another UI document, the button UI, which is just this simple button. You can see that it already has the callback that will debug log that the button has been clicked on. So let's add another game object to our scene for the third UI document, which will be the row for all of the buttons to sit on. So let's exit out of play mode here. I'm going to right click on main UI, create an empty game object. I will call this item row, or actually let's make that inventory as a more practical example for where this might go. Let's add a UI document component, and I'm going to find the source asset. So I could select from all of the ones in the project, but that's quite a few. I'll just kind of just drag and drop it in. Okay, so if we hit play, we won't see anything for that because it's just an empty visual element. But if I go to Window, UI Toolkit, Debugger, and let's pick an element on the screen, we'll be able to see that the inventory container is loaded in. So we're going to want a script for this inventory component. Let's actually just call that new script inventory. And we'll go ahead and edit this in Visual Studio. So I'm going to write void on enable. And when this script is enabled, we want to find the UI document that is on the game object with this inventory script. So we're going to want a field for the UI document, and I'll call that UI inventory. So UI inventory is going to be equal to get component UI document. Now the item button file we can load that in as a visual tree asset and then instantiate copies of it to add to our inventory UI. So I'm going to put in visual tree asset here, and then let's call it something like item button template. We'll need to make this public because we're going to reference it in the inspector. So we can find our game object with the inventory script, and I'm just going to drag item button right in here to visual tree asset. So with the item button template, we can do something like item button template dot instantiate, and that will create a copy of our visual tree asset. And then we'd be able to add this to one of the visual elements in our UI inventory in order to get this to show up there. So instantiate is going to give us a template container. So I'll just call this something like item button container equals that. And then our UI inventory, let's do UI inventory dot root visual element, because when you're adding things to the UI document hierarchy, you need to add it to a visual element. So we need to go to the root visual element and then find something beneath it that we want to hold all of these item buttons. So if we take a quick look at our UI builder, we have the item row here set up. So we could just find or query that item row element and use that to add the buttons to. So root visual element dot q, and we're going to search by name. So we want item row, I think it was called. And then we can do add item button container. Let me just double check the name. Okay, so that should probably work. Let's go to scene, hit play, test it. And look, we have a button that was created at runtime. However, it doesn't really do anything when we press on it, and it's not tied to any actual data. I'm going to bring in the inventory script to that folder UI at runtime. And let's create another class which can tie together our item button visual element with the data that we actually want it to interact with. So I'm going to right click, create a new C# script, and let's call it something like InventorySlot. And this isn't actually going to be a mono behavior script. We don't want to be adding it as a component to other game objects inside of our scene. And let's get rid of start update since there's a mono behavior methods. So this inventory slot, we're going to want to create a constructor for it. So I'll do public inventory slot. We'll have item data, which we haven't created yet. So item. And then we want the template asset, and we'll just actually create the visual element right when we're creating this object. So let's do visual tree asset template. Let's come back to this in a minute. First, I'm going to jump back to the project, create another script. Let's create a C# script. I'll call this item. Let's double click in here. And for the item, I am going to create it as a scriptable object. So a scriptable object allows you to create and store data inside of the assets folder of your project. So if you say wanted to create something like a item database, this would be one option to do it. And in order to actually create your scriptable objects, you need to put in up here at the top in square brackets, create asset menu, give it a file name. So let's do file name equals, and I'll just call this item, and then menu name. If you want to give it a path in the menu. So I guess I'll just do CT for Chris tutorials / item. Now it's not going to have a start and update method. It's not a mono behavior, but let's give the item some data. So for instance, we could have a string display name. I'm going to make this public so that we can actually edit it in the inspector. And then we could also have public sprite icon, which will be this icon's visual representation inside of the game. So I'll just keep it super simple here. Let's go back out. And now if we right click in our project folder, go to create, CT will have item as an option here. So we can just create these scriptable objects, and you can see that each of them has the fields that will store the data that we want attached to this item. So I can just call this item1 and display name item1. For the icon, we can just grab a random image. So it doesn't really matter for right now. Let's just create a couple more items. So item2, the display name, I'll just do the second item. For the icon, let's scroll down and grab something. Okay, cool. And let's make a third item. Item3, display name, magic potion, sprite. Let's see what we can get. This one, sure. So now we have 3 items with different data, and we can use that for creating our objects for the inventory slot class. And we could do something like load the icon into the visual tree template after we instantiate a copy of it. So in our inventory script, I no longer want to instantiate the copies here. I'm actually going to cut this bit and I'm going to put it into inventory slot. Just kind of paste that in there, and template is going to replace here. As for the UI inventory adding the item part, I guess I'm going to actually take that back out there. So we'll have to create a list of the objects here. And then for each one, we're going to add it to the UI inventory. So first we need some data to actually load in for all of the copies of that template. So let's do a public list of items. And then we'll take each of these items in a for each. So for each item in items, we're going to create a new inventory slot. So inventory slot, new slot equals new inventory slot. Okay, and then you can see the constructor there. We need to put in the item. So item, and then the template is the item button template. Okay, so this should give us the new slot. We can cut this bit right here, put that into here. And then we're gonna add the new slot, but the button that comes from it. And so we're going to take the visual element from the new slot and add it in here to the hierarchy. So let's see, new slot dot, I suppose we could say button. We haven't created that yet, but we can go ahead and generate the field for it. Now let's go back to the other script. And instead of a basic visual element, I'm actually going to make that a button, which is based on visual element, but obviously more specific because it can do all the on-click stuff. All right, so in our constructor here, we create a copy of the template. So for the button, let's go ahead and do button equals item button container. So the item button container, let's go ahead and query it for a specific type, and the type is going to be a button. So I think how this works is that it's just going to find the first button inside of the container, since there's no filters like name or class name. So we can go ahead and just check our template and make sure that there is the button. So item button, we can see we have a button here. Okay, and then after we find the button, we want to add a on-click event, which will interact with our item data somehow. So button.register callback click event. And then we need a method name here, so I'll just call it onClick. We'll have to create that function. So public void onClick, which is going to take a click event. And so when the button is clicked, we can have whatever code we want to run down here. So we wanted to interact with the item data, but we want to take our item data and make sure that it's still persisting around here after the constructor is done. So let's also add in here this .item equals item and go ahead and generate the field. I'll go ahead and make the item public so that we can easily see what's in the inventory slot from other classes. Down here for onClick, let's interact with this item somehow. So onClick, we'll do a debug log, and then let's say the inventory slot with the item name, item.displayName has been clicked. Okay, so now that we're done with the inventory slot, what we need to make sure is that we actually load up some items into the inventory. So we can see on the inventory, we have this list here, which is currently empty. If we go ahead and hit play, of course, you'll see that no buttons are loaded because we only have 0 items. So let's actually add to that list. I'll change the size to 3. And let's go to the project, and I will add in the items here. You could also click here and then select items from your project. So I'll just drag each of them in. You can even do it in whichever order you want. So if we hit play, we'll see we have 3 items. Let's look at the console. I'll click each one of them. So the inventory slot with item name item 1 has been clicked. Click on the second one, inventory slot with the item name. The second item has been clicked. And then the third one, magic potion, has been clicked. Now remember, those are the display names, which is a custom field we created for the scriptable object. It's not the actual file name of the scriptable object, but the display name string. So the other thing we can do with these UI elements is change certain parts about them based on our item data. So let's take the icon from the item and set it to be the icon for the button. So to do that, let's go to the, item slot. And when we're creating our copy of the button, we want to style the button. So we'll do button.style, background image. So there's a lot of properties you can set here. And we want to set that equal to the item icon. But as you can see, this doesn't directly take a sprite, it takes a style background. So we need to create that new object, new style background. And this is going to take the item icon as a parameter. So style background uses a sprite. And then when we have that style background, we can set that to be the background image on our button. So let's go back out to game view, hit play, and you can see that each of the buttons have been created with the icon from the item. And of course, they still have the click events for each of them. Now, having a debug log message isn't the most interesting thing and doesn't actually do much in the game, but you could see how you could go from here where with item data, you could use it to determine, say, which ability would be used when a button is pressed, or that kind of stuff. So that's going to be it for this tutorial on showing you guys how to generate UI elements based on item data on the fly. I hope this was helpful for you. I've been Chris, and I will see all of you in my future Unity content.